everybody. Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Alex McInturf. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Big Fish Lab at Oregon State University. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about what we do and how we study sharks, and in particular, what sharks we might have in Oregon, which might be relevant to most of you all, and how we conduct research on them around the world. I like to make my presentations pretty interactive. I think it's more fun for everybody. So periodically, I will ask you all some questions, and you can feel free to put those answers in the chat or unmute yourself. I can't see you, so that's probably the best way to answer for me. And I will try to get to your questions even as I go. And if I don't get to them, I'll answer the rest at the end. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so this is the very first question I'm going to ask you all. Because I like to get a sense of where people are coming from with their perspective of sharks, what you know, what you don't know. And you'd be surprised at the diversity of answers I get for this. So I'm curious from your all's perspective, what do you think makes a shark a shark? And you can even just throw out words, just word associations is a really good way to start, but even definitions or things that you think of. I'm curious to hear what you all think. Anyone? Nice. Okay, cool. We're going to start with cartilaginous skeleton. Yes, sharks do not have bones like we do. They are made of cartilage, and that is something that distinguishes them from every other species of fish. Big fish. Yes, they are big fish. We're going to talk about that just a little bit. Of course, we're called the Big Fish Lab, but that's not actually uniformly true. And that's a topic that I'm really interested in as well. Predatory, yes, they're often predatory, but again, not always. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Yeah, top of the food chain. That's certainly something everybody thinks of. So yes, this idea that they are big predators is really pervasive for sure. And protective eye coverings is a really unique one. I don't get that very often. I'm actually not planning on talking about shark physiology, but yes, a lot of them do have this membrane that covers their eyes when they're attacking prey. Not all of them do, though. So shark eyes, that's a really cool area of study. We are starting that here, but that's an area that I would like to learn more about too. And cold-blooded is another really interesting answer. And I'm going to get into that as well. Most, but not all sharks are cold-blooded, and that's something that I'm really interested in. Cool. Okay, that's an awesome start. It's so funny because I feel like people have these really niche ideas of what sharks are sometimes too. But no one actually gave the answer I was expecting, which was this. So inevitably, when we think about sharks, when most people think about sharks, this is the image that comes to their head, right? This idea of a mindless man-eating machine. And it's really shocking what a movie that was released in the late 1900s is still doing to the public psyche when we think about sharks. I mean, my mom still thinks about this when we think about sharks, and she's constantly wondering why in the world I do what I do. However, I do just want to say before we get into the definition of a shark, 1975, nice. This is actually what you're more likely to encounter ever than a live animal, regardless of whether you're in the water frequently or not, unfortunately. And so shark products are actually pretty widespread, and you might not even know that there are shark products that you might be consuming or purchasing. So shark is often marketed as other fish species that you might want to eat. It's in cartilage products, not surprisingly, given that they're cartilaginous fish. And it's in a lot of products, specifically in Asian countries, like shark fin soup. That is just a delicacy over there that unfortunately does contribute to mass overexploitation of sharks. And so this overfishing of sharks, even though we are increasingly aware that it's a problem, is not really stopping. These encounters are happening everywhere, including in Oregon. And so it's really important to consider that these negative perceptions of sharks can actually be really detrimental to public support for their conservation. So I always start with that to say, as Colby mentioned in the chat, sharks are not monsters. And we're going to talk about them a little bit more today. Right. So now that that's out of the way, you all mentioned a few ideas when you think of sharks, what traits you're thinking of. So I'm going to go through the ground rules for what makes a shark a shark. And then I will say that these are the only features that are in common across over 500 species. First, they are fish, and that might seem very basic, but I have had people ask if they are mammals before. So I just want to clarify, they are fish. They do swim underwater. They breathe underwater as well. Their skeletons are made of cartilage, as we've established. They're closely related to skates and rays, as well as chimeras, if you're familiar with those. All of those animals are chondrichthyans, which means that they have cartilaginous skeletons. Beyond those animals, every other species of fish has a bony skeleton. So we call them bony fish and cartilaginous fish. Most sharks have 5 gills, but there are some older or more primitive forms that I'm going to talk about today, actually a few of them, that have up to 7. And we don't know what these extra gills provide those sharks, but it's a really fascinating idea that they have them still, these ones that are over 400 million years old. So I say this too because sharks come in all shapes and sizes, and sometimes when people see something or catch something, they want to know if it's a shark, and usually the gills are a dead giveaway. Predators. Yes, so I put an asterisk here. I got predatory fish in the chat, and that totally makes sense. There are so many shark species. Shark diversity is something we're going to talk about in just a moment. A majority of them are actually less than 3 feet long. So when we think about predators, they're probably not predators in the way that you assume. So you certainly do have your apex species, the ones at the top of the food chain, like your white sharks or your tiger sharks, for example. But you also have smaller species that might serve as prey for larger species or even marine mammals or bigger fish. And so they're more in the middle of the food chain. And recently it's been discovered that some species even eat seagrass, and some of the larger species even eat plankton. So it really varies. And so when we think of predators, I do think that that's a little more nuanced than people often assume. And they are important to the ecosystem. And I don't know if any of you know why, and you're welcome to throw that in the chat too. But I will say, you know, we know that sharks are important to ecosystems because the ecosystems where sharks are absent are typically not very healthy. We see overpopulations of other organisms, and it doesn't really seem sustainable to support those organisms that are there. So yeah, keystone species, that's excellent. Yes, Bo. Often they are keystone species in the sense that they ensure that all of the populations in the ecosystems where they live are able to be in balance. So if you have sharks eating a certain fish population and those fish eating smaller fish, and you remove the shark, the fish that the sharks eat, they're going to become very abundant and perhaps overeat species smaller in the food or further down in the food chain. And the challenge with that, of course, is that that's not sustainable either. And then the food chain collapses. And that's something we call a trophic cascade. That's a really simplified understanding of what might happen in the absence of sharks. So I just want to say it is really complex. Food chains are challenging to understand, but it's definitely something that we want to continue to unveil as we study sharks more. Okay, so that's it. Those are all kind of the key rules about what makes a shark a shark. And as I said, there's over 500 species, and they are so diverse. They range in size from the size of a pencil. That's a lantern shark. It's a deep sea species there on your upper left. And they can grow to the size of a small school bus, over 30 feet long, with your whale sharks or your basking sharks can be about 20 feet long. And they eat plankton, which is very interesting. They also have different reproductive strategies. So some sharks lay eggs, some sharks give birth to live young, some sharks do a weird combination of the two where the young hatch inside of the mother. Some individuals in the womb will eat other animals, or they will eat the egg yolks that the mother keeps producing. So their reproduction is really, really interesting. And I'm not going to talk about this today, but we actually just got a reproductive specialist here at OSU. He's one of the only people in the world who study shark reproduction. So that's something we're really interested in pursuing. And yeah, sharks can occupy all different habitats, from coastal areas, they might not move very much there, to traversing across entire ocean basins. And so this is one of my favorite things about them is once you think you figured out what a shark is, you pretty quickly find out that there's a lot of exceptions to these rules. Okay, so yes, some of these sharks obviously live here in Oregon, and that's what I'm going to shift gears and talk about now. And what I will say is, I did my PhD down in California, and everybody knows there's sharks down there. When I was recruited to come up here a couple of years ago, I said, why? Why am I going there to study sharks, right? Are there sharks in Oregon? And I think that's something that's really interesting and really telling, right? A lot of people don't know there are sharks here, and that's what we have been established to start to learn as a group. So if you've been to the Oregon coast, it's quite pretty. And it's home to a lot of economically and ecologically important organisms, like, for example, salmon. Now, there's been a lot of work to date studying the impacts of a lot of predators on these keystone prey species like salmon or hake, for example, or whiting. And so we know the relative impact of humans or of seals and sea lions, of birds or of orcas, right? But there's something that's missing in this food web. And again, this is where we have started to come in. We've started to come in to address these gaps. And that is an understanding of what the sharks are doing here. What is their role in Oregon's food webs? So our goal is to create those links as a group. So the Big Fish Lab, which I work for, was established in 2019. I joined in 2021, and we currently have a wide variety of folks at different career stages of different backgrounds with different specialties. And what's very cool is that the one thing we have in common is a passion for studying sharks and their relatives. Now, we are currently studying several of the 15 different species of sharks in Oregon. You can see them here, and I'm only going to talk about a select few today. But you can see that we have sharks as small as 2.2 feet. That's the brown cat shark. And then historically, we've had basking sharks here, which are those really big ones. And I do still study those. We're going to talk about that today, but those are incredibly rare here now. So if anybody ever sees an animal that looks very large, a little bit like a sea monster, please let me know. And if you are ever out on the water or on the beach and you see a shark that's washed up, we do have a shark ID page on our website to help people identify their sharks. And we really want them to be reported to us. Not only does it help us understand where these sharks are going and maybe when, based on where they wash up or where you see them, but we can do a lot of lab work with deceased animals. So it helps us target our field efforts and it helps us target our lab work. But how do you study sharks, right? We often can't actually keep them in captivity. You can't do experiments on them the same way you might do with smaller species. So before I jump into our specific projects, I do just want to talk a little bit about the different methods we use to answer our questions. Right, so we do not live in the same domain as sharks. We cannot watch them all the time underwater. So we have to get really creative here. And just for reference, that is a basking shark relative to the size of our boat. That was taken with a drone in Ireland, which is where my field work on basking sharks currently takes place. And that's me in the middle there looking over the side at that shark. We cannot bring that shark on our boat, right? So again, we have to get really creative with how we're studying a lot of these animals. Now, we often rely on pretty advanced forms of technology, which is very cool. It is also quite expensive, so it does limit kind of our capabilities often, depending on our funding sources. But in general, we use these devices called tags. And a tag is just kind of a catch-all term for a device that measures movement and behavior. And we have different types of tags depending on the different research questions we're asking. So an acoustic tag is something that sends out a sound underwater, sound signal. And sound is really useful to us because it travels further and faster underwater than it does on land. So we can deploy these tags externally via a dart that goes underneath the skin of the animal, or we can actually surgically implant them, and they can last up to 6 years. And what these tags do is they send out an individual ID. Of course, we have to have something in the water listening for that sound. So we do keep these devices called receivers moored to the seafloor, or we can lower them down from the boat if we're in an area. And those record whenever tagged animals are around. So if we have tagged sharks out and we have these receivers along the Oregon coastline, which we have at the moment, we can download the data from those receivers and say, hey, shark 1, 2, 3, 4 showed up every day for the month of April. And that's really interesting to us because it tells us, oh, there's a seasonal pattern to when they're showing up. And because they can last for so long, these 6-year tags, we can also look at whether they're continuing to come to Oregon year after year, or whether maybe they're just passing through the one time. If we want to look at longer term movements, not just kind of a presence or absence information, we'll use what's called a satellite tag. And as the name suggests, basically this will be affixed to the outside of the animal and transmit the animal's location to satellite overhead every time the shark pops out of the water. So the sharks will often surface swim. And so we have to affix that tag to the dorsal fin so that it can connect to satellite. And that can last for over a year. And every time that shark comes out of the water, no matter where it is, we will get a location, which is very, very cool. And it helps us kind of learn more about the sharks away from our coastline. And finally, we have camera tags. I like to also say they're animal Fitbits because they contain an accelerometer. That's the same thing that's in your watch or your phone that tells you how many steps you took. So what these will do is they will simultaneously give us a shark's eye view of what's going on because we'll put it on the dorsal fin and it will record the video. But we will also be able to see how the shark's body moves in response to its surroundings. So for example, if we see in the video, if we see a prey item and we see a lot of movement in the tag, that tells us that maybe the shark went after that prey. And that's really interesting as well. So that gives us more information on their behavior. Just quickly, I want to answer Sarah's question in the chat. That's a really good question. Can the sharks hear the sound that the acoustic tag emits, and does it influence their natural behavior? So sharks do have ears. Unexpectedly, they're on the tops of their heads. As far as we can tell, it does not affect their behavior. We're more concerned about making sure the tagging process does not stress them out. And so typically what researchers will do is we will discard the first 24 hours of tag data in case the sharks are responding in a strange way or behaving in a strange way because of the tag. But there is no real evidence that they can hear what the acoustic tag is transmitting. It's a good question and perhaps more applicable to something like whales, where they use that sonar. That might be really important for them. But for sharks, so far, there's no evidence of that. But it's a really good question. Okay, so that's tagging. But we also, as I mentioned, we do a lot of work in the lab. And so that includes dissections. We do a lot of dissections, and I've learned how to dissect a shark a lot since I started my postdoc. I had never led a dissection before. Dissections for us are really important for a few reasons. First, again, we get a lot of animal strandings on the beach, particularly at this time of year. We're sort of wrapping up salmon shark stranding season. So I'm going to talk about salmon sharks in just a bit. But we've had several species, mako sharks, thresher sharks, salmon sharks. They'll wash ashore dead. And we love when people report them to us because we will freeze them. And then we can go through and start to figure out what their role in the ecosystem might be. We do that via a few methods. First, you're looking at a stomach content analysis progression. So on the left, that's the shark's stomach. We will extract it and cut it open, and we can inspect what's inside. It's like a big treasure hunt. What's interesting is that, of course, a lot of the prey has been digested past the point of recognition. So we get a lot of just fleshy chunks, but there are pieces of prey that do not digest very well, and that includes otoliths. So what you're seeing on the right and also underneath the microscope, to some degree, those are the inner ear bones of bony fish. So not shark, skates, or rays. Bony fish have inner ear bones, and they are uniquely shaped according to the species. And so we can actually count the number of ear bones and identify which species they came from to determine how many of what type of prey they're eating. We can do the same thing with squid beaks. So we are finding squid beaks, and we're finding a lot of otoliths in these stomachs. We can also take muscle and liver and blood. And those tissues are important because we can conduct what's known as stable isotope analysis. That's just a really jargony way of saying we can look at the chemical composition of those tissues or samples because you are what you eat, and we can match them up to the chemical composition of the same tissues or samples from their prey. So these dead sharks can actually give us a lot of information. And I do want to note that we cannot keep many species in captivity, so we don't, but there are a few that do well. So on the left is a skate, and on the right are some baby bat rays from the aquarium. And with these species, we're able to look at stuff like response to different chemical cues underwater. Do they transmit some form of cue when they're stressed? We also have a project going on looking at how skates respond to changes in the magnetic field in their environment. Sharks have extra senses compared to us. They have magnetoreceptors, so they detect magnetic fields. They also have electroreceptors, which means that they can detect electric fields of their prey. And so we can manipulate those factors in a tank and see how the sharks respond to those, or sorry, the skates as well. We could probably put some smaller sharks in these tanks, but we haven't tried it yet. So that's a general overview of our work. So now I'm just going to, of how we study these animals broadly. And now I'm going to jump into how we combine these tools and methods to answer our specific questions related to different species. So first, I mentioned salmon sharks. This is one of my personal projects. Salmon sharks are what I call fun-sized white sharks. They are much smaller. They're about 6 to 8 feet long on average, whereas your white shark is probably 16 to 20 feet. And they have this notoriously speckled belly, which is very interesting. We do see them washed up on shore. There's a disproportionate number of salmon shark strandings here, Waldport, Lincoln City, Pacific City, all up and down our coastline here. We see those basically from June through now. So we love getting reports of those so we can dissect them for my project in particular. So what we're doing with this is essentially answering a few different questions, mostly related to the role that they play in different ecosystems. So we're doing that stomach content analysis I mentioned. We're also doing that stable isotope analysis where we look at different tissues. So we're using a lot of these stranded animals to do that. We're also putting out some satellite tags. And with those data, I can monitor where the sharks are going throughout the Pacific, and I can actually do some modeling to sort of identify what environmental factors they might be responding to. Another part of my project is doing the same thing with salmon and trying to see whether salmon sharks overlap with salmon all the time, or only for part of the year, or only in certain locations. So what is their overlap with their prey like? My overarching question initially was, to what degree do these species feed on salmon, right? Their name is salmon shark. And my unpublished answer to you all is, I don't see a lot of salmon in their stomachs at all. In fact, I have found none. So maybe salmon shark is a misnomer. Colby, I'm going to jump to your question at the end, if that's okay, because I think aggressive behavior is something that warrants a further answer. Okay. We also are, so this in the upper left is a satellite tag that I mentioned. So I'm using those data. That's what a satellite tag looks like when it's on an animal. This is also a good idea, or a good image of how we use the cameras that I showed you. So this is actually footage from a salmon shark up in Alaska. You're going to see the Alaskan coastline. And what we're trying to do with these cameras is see whether we can identify prey eating events, and specifically what type of prey they might be eating from the camera footage. So again, that's the Alaskan coastline, and you can see that these sharks are at the surface actually quite a bit. Okay. Right, so that's one part of my project. The other species that I love to work with, it's my favorite shark species by far, is the basking shark. And I have been working with this species since my PhD. I've mentioned them a few times. This is the world's second largest fish, and they are plankton eaters. So we call them planktivores. They're one of 3 filter feeding species of shark, including the whale, the megamouth, and of course the basking shark. So what you're seeing in this image right now is the basking shark actually filtering water through its gills. Its mouth is open. It's filter feeding. It will capture those plankton inside specialized mechanisms in the gill slits, and then it will swallow. So what's very cool about these animals is that they're capable of crossing entire ocean basins. We know that they do. But at specific times of year, they gather along certain coastlines, like in Ireland and like historically in California. They have been overexploited in those places. They used to be targeted for the liver oil for lighting streets in areas like Belfast, for example. But I'm trying to understand what's driving them to these locations, and in particular, whether they might be social. And I'm happy to talk more about my work with the social lives of sharks at the end, if that's of interest. But I do not think there's a random pattern to them showing up, and I'm currently looking at whether they constantly show up with the same individuals, which is very cool. How do you tag a basking shark, you might ask? Well, we get really creative. So this is me at the helm, or sorry, at the bow in Ireland this year. We are just pole darting one of our tags into the dorsal side of the shark. A few things I want you to note here. The shark is actually okay, right? I know that looks a little gnarly, but realistically, those sharks end up resuming normal feeding behavior. We see them at the surface within less than 5 minutes, typically. Sharks have incredibly tough skin, and so that is easy for us to do. And then also, to tie into the social behavior, they were all swimming in this line, which is super interesting. And again, these are the behaviors that are driving my questions about social lives of sharks, because they're not swimming in these random patterns, which is cool. Just as a quick note, some of these tags require recovery. So some of the tags will store data on them. The cameras will store the data. Some of our acoustic tags will store data. That means you have to get them back. And as you can imagine, that's like finding a needle in a haystack. So we have specialized release mechanisms we attach to the sharks, and then these will float to the surface and transmit their location once they're at the surface. And I say all that because we can sometimes spend 3 times the number of days on the water just trying to find our tags. Each of those tags can cost $5,000 or more. So if you ever see packages like the ones you're seeing here, anything bright that washes up on the beach that might have some contact information on it, please call that person. It's really incredible when we're able to involve folks who are non-scientists and they're able to report the tags and get them back to us. It's a cool way for people to be involved in the process. Right. Now, of course, I'm sure many of you were wondering, if you don't know already, do we have white sharks in Oregon? The answer is yes, we do. We are currently actively working on trying to monitor them here. Most of the work on white sharks to date has been done in California. And right now we have a master's student who's trying to start monitoring them here. We're going to try to put cameras on them. We're going to try to put some satellite tags and acoustic tags on them. So the animal you see on the bottom right is actually double tagged. And so that's an acoustic tag in front and a satellite tag in the back. And again, those are really useful for us because we can answer different questions with those types of data. Anecdotally, most of the white sharks that I've heard about people seeing that have been reported to us have been up near Seaside, but we do get them at the South Jetty here as well. So as well as down in Port Orford. But again, if people are seeing anything that resembles a white shark and is much bigger than a salmon shark, we want to know about it. Tagging white sharks is pretty similar to how we would tag a basking shark. So it looks something like this. Just tagging from the boat. And there you can see just underneath the dorsal fin, the tag that will be transmitting for the next 6 years. And what information those tags give us is pretty cool. So this is a video of white sharks that were tagged in Baja as well as California. They're doing some crazy behaviors here. What we're seeing is that they're going to the middle of the Pacific to nowhere and just gathering. And that area is now called the White Shark Cafe because it happens so consistently. So certainly you do get some that go to Hawaii, but what they're doing where there's no land masses around, we don't know what prey sources they have here. That's a question scientists are still trying to answer. And now that's driving research expeditions from folks at Stanford out to the White Shark Cafe. They want to know what's going on out there. So that's very cool. Now, I mentioned we had a study going on about the more primitive species of sharks, so the seven gills. I would say shark scientists are not super creative with the naming process. So seven gill sharks characteristically have seven gills. And again, these are some of the oldest species. And so Jess Schulte is a PhD student in our lab, and she is studying them primarily up in Willapa Bay in Washington, where there's a population that seems resident there year round, or at least through October. And then they come back in around March, which is also very interesting. Similar to the salmon shark work, she's studying what they're eating, what roles they might play in the food web there, and where they're going. So she's acoustic tagging a lot of animals up there, which is very cool. Just to jump to some questions really quick, just to give you all a break with the information. Does it harm the shark while tagging? You know, I think that's a question all shark scientists ask themselves at some point. You know, are we doing a lot of harm? Evidence suggests no. Sharks are incredibly hardy animals. For example, the way that they mate is they grab on to, males will grab onto females with their teeth. So we can actually identify mating females because they have scars all along their body. So our darts are quite small, and we often, just from my perspective, will not even see a response from the shark when we put the tag on. So I think it's a really good question, but we do it as carefully as we possibly can, and we try to minimize invasiveness. Tina asked how difficult it is to get the boats close enough to the sharks while we're tagging. It depends. So white sharks, you can lure to the boat a little bit. You can chum, and then you can also lure them in with like a seal decoy at the surface. So you have some sort of control over how close they're getting to the boat. And white sharks are inherently very curious. They love to bite engines when we're out there. So they have no problem getting close to the boat. They're also apex predators at the top of the food chain. So we're not seeing a lot of fear from them. So that's not too bad. Basking sharks are super weird. They're really hard to study. I say they're more like whales than they are like sharks. We can't bring them close to the boat because they eat plankton. We cannot chum for plankton. So what we do is we just wait till they surface, and then we have to work with a really experienced boat operator. And they will come in kind of just behind the eye of the shark. And then we'll tag it before the shark goes under. So basking sharks also unexpectedly are at the top of a very small food chain. They don't technically have any predators because they're so big, but they just eat plankton. So we don't think of them as apex predators. But when we've been in the water with them, they are not afraid of you. So they don't show a lot of fear either. So yeah, so it's tricky. It totally depends on the species. John French, I know it's hard to generalize, but how do you see climate change affecting shark populations here? I'm going to save that one to the end because I think that's a really important thing to talk about as well. So don't let me forget, because I think that just warrants a much bigger conversation. And then Brad, you mentioned you did not see any salmon in the salmon sharks. Yes, what we're finding predominantly are hake, also known as whiting, which is interesting because they're a species that, of course, we eat. So we are seeing hake. We're also seeing a lot of California market squid. We've also seen evidence of rockfish and flatfish. And Michael, how do salmon sharks acquire their name? They did acquire their name actually because they used to be seen feeding at river mouths up in Alaska as the salmon were out migrating. And salmon fishermen here will still see them. But interestingly, in Russia, they're called, the translation is herring shark because they also eat herring. We also know they eat mackerel. So I think that they got that name. People seem to assume that they generalize, or they specialize in salmon. My current assessment is that they are more generalist and they just kind of eat whatever they can find. And then Eric, how far off the coast do you see the sharks for the most part? It really depends on the species. For salmon sharks, we have to go 20, 30 miles offshore. But people have gotten amazing drone footage actually in the surf at Otter Rock here of a salmon shark swimming just by the surfers, which is very cool. And salmon fishermen closer to shore, maybe within 10 miles, will also report seeing salmon sharks. We also see blue sharks everywhere. close inshore and offshore. And the white sharks primarily will stick to coastal areas. So it just totally depends. Really good questions. Yeah, so I will come back to the climate change question as well as the aggression question at the end. Cool. We do also have one project, and I mentioned the skates being in captivity and looking at how they respond to magneto and electroreception or electric fields. And we do have another researcher in our lab who was using those experimental setups to look at how they might respond to the offshore renewable energy infrastructure that's being proposed off the coast of Oregon. The Oregon coast is a really windy place, right? And so currently it's been proposed to place a bunch of wind turbines out there, and that energy will be transmitted via cable underwater to centralized locations along the Oregon coast. Those cables, though, are likely to change these magnetic and electric fields that these animals like skates and sharks might use to navigate or hunt. And so Kyle is looking at what happens when you adjust those fields and how long does it take the animals to resume their normal behavior, which is very cool. Right. Okay, so now that you've seen some of the sharks that we study, I just wanted to kind of review a few others that you might see or encounter in Oregon. Again, we have our multi-gilled shark, right? We have the 6-gill shark. So we have a 7-gill, we have a 6-gill. The 6-gill shark is in Oregon. It's really hard to observe because they tend to be a deeper water shark, but they're big. They're about 15 to 16 feet long, and people have reported catching them on long lines here. We don't know much about them other than that they seem to feed nocturnally and ambush prey. And again, they seem very similar. They have a very similar body shape to those 7-gill sharks that I showed you earlier. Spiny dogfish. These are really common. People have seen them. I mean, they're actually in the Oregon Coast Aquarium. They're in aquaria kind of worldwide because they're very ubiquitous. They're easy to keep in captivity. They are so named because they actually have a little spine at the base of their dorsal fin at the very front, which you might be able to see on the bottom right picture. And they have these little speckles down their back, which is very cool. So I'm actually starting a project next year on spiny dogfish and where they're going and how often they might overlap with fisheries, because they seem to travel in big groups. And unfortunately, that means that a lot of people who are fishing will catch them in their nets in huge numbers, which is a problem for the shark population, and it's a problem for the fishermen. So I'm working on sort of modeling their movements using those satellite tags to try to see where they're going and when and under what conditions to help fishermen ideally avoid them in the future. Then we have our taupe or school shark. This is probably the sharkiest looking shark you'll ever see. It just looks like a shark, right? There's no kind of unique feature about it. It's about 6 feet long. It's like a gray brown. They're found worldwide. They are interesting because, of course, as their name suggests, they do school in big numbers. But they're also known as a soup fin shark. That's another common name for them. Because of their tendency to school, they're easily captured, like the spiny dogfish. And this species was heavily targeted in the mid-20th century for shark fin soup, which again is that delicacy in Asian countries. So they are still called a soup fin shark. Blue sharks, I've mentioned that we'll see those here as well. They are beautiful animals. They are blue, so their name is very appropriate. They're very sleek. They are widely roaming. They're perhaps one of the most common species you will see. We get massive groups of them around the boat whenever we're fishing, and I've gotten some footage from fishermen at sea who just have them everywhere. So we do see them. We are kind of looking at them as a potential climate change indicator. So I'll bring that back in when I talk about the climate change question. They are cold-blooded. They're one of the cold-blooded species, but they can't go in. So that means they can't go in super cold temperatures. We are starting to see them in places like Alaska, which is not a good sign for the temperatures of those areas, right? It means that those oceans are warming enough that they can support blue sharks now. So we're sort of using them maybe as an indicator species of how the oceans are changing temperature. And then we have the thresher shark, and this is a crowd favorite. It has this enormous tail. We actually had one washed up in Seaside a couple months ago that we were able to dissect. They are usually found in open ocean and further offshore, but we do see them come into bays occasionally. So what's cool about these animals, I just had to show you in a video. It's really hard to find this footage, but Discovery Channel was able to do it. So I just want to show you really quickly how these animals hunt. So what you're seeing here is a school of fish. I turned the sound off because it's unnecessary. That's a thresher shark, and it's stunning the animals with its tail. So that is how they hunt their prey, and that's what the use of the tail is. They're really incredible to see. And again, they're unusual to find here, but it's not unheard of. And then once the animals are stunned, their prey is stunned, they will eat them. So that's the thresher shark. Very cool. We finally have a mako shark. We actually dissected one of these for our outreach event this past weekend. These are the fastest sharks. Oh, give me 2 seconds. Oh, sorry. You're good. That's okay. I'm just in the middle of a talk. You're good. Sorry, everyone. This is what happens when you're in the office pretty late. So mako shark, one of the fastest animals in the ocean. Its moving speeds are about 30 miles per hour, with estimated bursts of up to 50 miles per hour. So they're incredibly fast. They're closely related to salmon sharks and white sharks, sometimes used as a sport fish. So it's very cool that they're around here. They're about kind of intermediate in size between the white shark and the salmon shark. I think the one we had here was 11 feet long. All right. Now, I always like to conclude because, our work does not operate in a vacuum. And that's part of the reason I'm here talking to you. It's part of the reason we do a lot of the work that we do in terms of outreach and education. There's not been a dedicated research lab to sharks in Oregon ever. People have worked on sharks as part of NOAA or Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. There hasn't been a centralized database of any of the sightings, of any of the trends in the populations that people have seen here. But certainly us as scientists, we're new here. So we really are relying on non-scientists, people who walk the beaches, who are on the water. We rely on them to give us information that we're missing. So we do have as I've plugged, have you seen sharks? We have the sightings campaign. You can report all sharks you observe on our website. We do want those dead animals. That's really valuable to us. And we do love talking to people about what they know about sharks or what they don't. Again, a key part of our mission too is reversing this stigma of sharks as mindless man-eaters, because they're not. If you are interested in attending any of our events, we do a lot of live events. So you'll see those on the outreach page of our website. You'll also see us in the news. So we try to go, I actually live in Portland part-time, so I'm on KATU sometimes. And we're on Shark Week as well. So we really try to make sure that the word gets out there about what we're doing, and also why people should respect rather than necessarily fear these animals. And I did just want to say, I think Katie was talking about this before people were all on here. We had this amazing event this past weekend. It was the first time ever we'd had it, but we're hoping to make it an annual event. It's called Sharktober Fest. We do a dissection in front of everybody of a stranded animal. And this year we also did a Shark Week showing, and it was very cool. We were able to develop partnerships with communities, members, as well as Pelican Brewing, and a few other businesses as well along the coastline, which was really exciting. And we're hoping to continue those partnerships. And if there are any educators in this group, we do have open source curricula on there that is developed with some of our tagging data, which is really cool. It's a chance for students to really play with the data itself. And that's a unique opportunity, I think, for a lot of people. Finally, we did just start taking donations. So if you are interested in supporting our work, we would really appreciate it. Like I said, shark science is unfortunately historically underfunded. So that's an option as well. But otherwise, I will get to some questions. Cool. I guess I will start by jumping back to aggression. So Colby asked, one time I saw a baby bat ray raise its tail. Does that mean aggressive behavior? It's really hard to say. Certainly, it's probably something to pay attention to. I am an animal behaviorist by training, and sharks will do unique behaviors like hunch their back and lower their side fins if they're feeling threatened, but a lot of people don't know to look for these cues. So I would say there's not been a lot of studies, as far as I know, on aggressive behavior in bat rays. My guess is that would be more of a defensive behavior if it was being approached by something, but it certainly depends on the context in which it was doing that. Animals send signals all the time, and trying to decode those signals is one of my favorite things to do, but it's an immense challenge too. And then I wanted to talk about climate change. So I mentioned at the beginning that most sharks are cold-blooded, but not all of them are. And I also mentioned a few different species in the talk, and also that we have here in Oregon, that are technically not cold-blooded. And that includes the mako shark, white shark, thresher shark, and salmon shark. They are what we call regional endotherms, which means that they can partially regulate their own body temperature. So they're not dependent on the environment around them to keep them hot or cold. They do have specialized blood systems to make sure that warm blood is staying within the body and going to certain parts that it needs to keep warm, like the brain or the eyes. What's unique about regional endotherms as well is that they keep their red muscle close to their vertebrae, whereas most sharks keep red muscle around the outside. Now that red muscle, they have red muscle and white muscle, just like a chicken or a turkey or whatever. And that red muscle allows them to keep that warmed up muscle close to their core, so they're not losing heat to the environment. So when we talk about climate change, the number one thing we think about are changing temperatures. And I bring up this regional endotherm cold-blooded kind of dichotomy to say it's going to really depend on the species. So our white sharks, our salmon sharks, coral beagle sharks on the East Coast, thresher sharks, they can all thrive in cold environments. They can hunt their prey. They can move faster than the prey can move because their bodies are primed. It's like constantly being warmed up like an athlete. So they thrive in these environments. Species like the blue shark that I mentioned earlier cannot do that because they don't have the physiology to. They are cold-blooded. So when we do talk about climate change, we are starting to see shifts in where these sharks are showing up. In the Pacific Northwest, we're starting to see species that were formerly in warmer waters come up north. And in particular, I was in Alaska last year trying to find salmon sharks, and everybody's reporting blue sharks up there instead. So the challenge with that is that as these species are moving north, they're potentially displacing or competing with species that used to be up there feeding. So that's certainly something that could potentially affect them. The other impact is that prey are potentially moving. And so that's something we have to pay attention to as well. So yes, it is species dependent. It is also what they eat. It's prey dependent. But the movement patterns are something that we're trying to pay really close attention to, which is why this tagging is really critical. Cool. Okay, Philip Johnson, can you say anything further about sharks' response to electrical currents through cables? Any preliminary interactions? Will there be more information available in time for consideration with regard to offshore wind? So I can't say too much about this project because the results aren't done yet, and I am not running that experiment. My guess is that it's going to be really complex because even our understanding of how sharks navigate or skates navigate, we assume they're moving according to magnetic fields. They seem responsive to changes in those magnetic fields, but we aren't totally sure if they're able to, pass a cable and recover, or if it's really going to throw them off for a long time. So no preliminary indications as of yet is my understanding. My understanding also is, so we're working with the PacWave folks and people who are developing this infrastructure to ensure that we can get these data to them in time. But my understanding is that it's going to be a few years before that's actually established. And I will also say there's interest in seeing how other organisms will respond as well, like crabs. So yeah, that's kind of the best I can say to that at the moment. It's an area of active research in our lab, but I don't know the results myself just yet. Bo, also on climate change, is there any data linking warming waters to female sharks changing their birthing grounds? I love that question because, like I said, we now have this reproductive specialist here, which is incredible. And so what we are developing are these, I have them here, birth tags, which look like this. And you can insert them inside the opening. So sharks have one opening. It's called a cloaca. That's where they poop. That's also where the baby sharks come out. And so we can insert this into the cloaca. It nestles among the young. And then when the shark gives birth, it just pops out, floats to the surface, and transmits the location. And that gives us information on where sharks are giving birth, because most of the time, for almost all species, we do not know that information. There is evidence to suggest that pregnant females like to occupy slightly warmer waters to assist with gestation, but we don't know that for sure for all of them. So for sure, it could affect them. If the sharks are indeed using warmer waters or specific waters at a specific temperature to assist in this gestation, then that might affect their ability to reproduce. There is a lab in French Polynesia and a project called the Physio Shark Project, if you're interested in following them. They are actively working on how climate change, like ocean acidification and temperature, affect like reproduction and development of young. So that's a really cool group to follow. Colby, is there any shark volunteering? I don't know if I am going to answer this correctly, so feel free to follow up. I always start by saying we want to make our field as accessible as possible to people. A huge challenge right now is there's not a lot of good representation in our field. It's really dominated by men, which is fine. It's also historically been a little bit pay to play. And what I mean by that is it's been something that you have to kind of volunteer your time to do at the expense of perhaps a job. And that kind of excludes a lot of the population who don't have the means to participate. So when we talk about volunteering, we really want to ensure that we can pay our volunteers so that we're not biased towards the part of the population that can afford to not have a job in order to volunteer, if that makes sense. So we are trying to be aware of that. It's certainly easier to volunteer if you are retired or if you we do have a marketing person actually who volunteers with us who has another job and she just really wants to do our marketing. And if you're a student, that also is its own kind of can of worms. So we could talk about that more if that's of interest to you. Bo, yeah, how could that affect predation on shark pups? Well, it's a really good question. So much of shark behavior, survival, basic information, it's missing. We don't have a lot of this information for many, many species. But, certainly temperature affects a lot of components of animals, right? It affects where they can go. It affects their metabolism. So certainly it could result in pups being more vulnerable if they can't really deal with the heat, and other sharks can. Maybe they're easier to predate upon, but that requires us knowing where the pups are and also being able to track them. And that's really hard to do. Any other questions? Don't see any.
Well, I just want to say, I know that there are some Coast Watchers, some of our Coast Watch volunteers here in the audience. And so it's great to know that you are all taking sightings of sharks. So that's something that we can share with our Coast Watchers as a resource for when they're out there walking their miles and doing their reports. So that's a really exciting way that we could maybe, connect to your work a little bit as well.
Totally.
Yeah. And then if anybody has any more questions, we've got a few more minutes, but I just want to let everybody know before you hop off, if you are going to be in the Newport area on November 3rd, we're hosting an estuary trivia night at the Nye Beach Tap House. And I just put the link in the chat for anybody that's interested in more information. So it's a free event. We just ask that you register so we can plan for participation. And we'll be doing teams of up to 6, and we'll have some awesome prizes for the trivia winners. And we'll also have raffle prizes available. So it's going to be a very cool event if any of you are interested in attending that.
Cool. Yeah. And I will just say, if y'all have people who are walking the beach, just to jump back to that, you do see a dead shark. One thing I ask is that you like move it up on the beach or you call us, because we've been after sharks before that have been washed out with the tide. So if you can stick around by it after you call us, that's even better. But I respect that not everybody has the time to wait around. So yeah, just getting location information and moving it out of the way of the tide is super helpful to us.
Awesome.
And then also that event sounds amazing. I live in Newport and Nye Beach is great. So
perfect.
That.
All right, last call for questions from anybody.
Yes, there's not. I will give you my phone number now. There's not, it's like the dedicated phone number goes to my supervisor, but he is traveling a lot. So I will just put this number in there for now. It's also on our website and on our social media. So if you could, if you could like just call me immediately, I can send a grad student or we can go. That would be great. Yeah, Colby, I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's awesome to hear that so many people are supportive of sharks. And you know, I get that they can be scary. I think that's how I got into them, because I wanted to deal with the fear. And I think that's actually a healthy response, but it's cool to see also the support in Oregon for shark research.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex, so much for sharing all of that awesome shark knowledge with us. And we're excited to keep learning about what you all do and sharing it with the rest of Oregon Shores.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. If anybody you know wanted to see this webinar but couldn't make it, we'll be posting the recording on our YouTube channel soon, so you can keep an eye out on our social media for when that's up. All right. Thank you. Good night.
Yeah.